Hello, my name is Megha Pradhan, and I'm the Director of the Center for Learning and Evaluation of Results for South Asia. In this video, I will discuss how to develop a program theory of change. This is the last of 4 videos in the series about the applications of monitoring and evaluation tools in the context of climate action. In this video, I will present a step-by-step approach to developing a theory of change with an application to a real-world example of a solar energy project funded by the World Bank. While video 3 provided a brief introduction on theory of change, in this video, I'll talk in more depth about the essential components of theory of change. I will explore the 5 fundamental steps involved in constructing a theory of change. These steps provide a structured approach to defining goals, outcomes, interventions, assumptions, and indicators. I'll also discuss approaching the theory of change with a system lens. And lastly, I'll draw conclusions from our exploration today, summarizing the key takeaways regarding theory of change, its components, the building process, system lens application, and how it all relates to effective climate interventions. Let's begin with what exactly do we mean by theory of change. Theory of change is a roadmap guiding us towards our desired results and outlining the processes involved. It serves as a strategic reflection process, helping us explore and understand change. By mapping out how a program leads to the change that I want to see, a theory of change is able to express causal link between inputs and activities and the subsequent outcomes and impacts of program implementation. This causal connection helps us comprehend how our actions and efforts lead to change. A theory of change is often represented visually, typically in a schematic diagram, and is useful to express as a series of if and then statements. These are the connected building blocks or components of a theory of change. Inputs, which are the financial, human, material, and institutional resources needed for the project. We have the activities, which are actions taken or work performed through which inputs are mobilized to produce outputs. Outputs are the products, capital goods, and services that result from an intervention. These are essentially the tangible products and services that are delivered to people as part of the project. Outcomes are the short-term and medium-term effects of an intervention's outputs. These are often knowledge and behavioral changes that we expect to see in people as a result of the outputs that are being delivered. Impacts, which are the higher-level effects of an intervention's outcomes. These are really our intended results of the program and the goals that we've been working towards. And finally, the assumptions, which are the conditions that make it possible to link activities to outputs, outputs to outcomes, and outcomes to impacts. Now that we have a basic understanding of what a theory of change is, let's learn about how to actually develop one. There are 5 key steps to building a theory of change, which are conducting a situational analysis, setting the goal, designing the program, mapping the causal pathway, and explicating assumptions. I'll go through each one of them through a real-world example. This case study is of a project funded by the World Bank for solar energy provision in Guinea-Bissau, a small country on the West African coast with a population of 2 million inhabitants. The project, which started in 2021 and is expected to achieve completion by 2025, consists of installing mini solar grids on the Bijigos Islands. Its objective is to increase access to energy in Guinea-Bissau. The mini grids will also contribute to improving the quality and reducing the costs of electricity supply. It is also hoped that the installation will have positive impacts on tourism activities. The first step in building a theory of change is to do a situational analysis. It is critical to understand the context and identify the key problem you want to address before you begin to design a relevant solution. So what does this look like in our case study? Only 29% of Guinea-Bissau's population has access to electricity, with around 58% in the capital city, Bissau. There are substantial disparities in this access. For example, the national gender gap in access to electricity is of 5% and rises up to 10% in the Bijigos Islands. Electricity is both scarce and very costly, making it among the most expensive in the African continent at present. The demand-supply gap is immense. In 2018, it was estimated that the country's electricity peak demand is more than double the installed generation capacity, leading to recurrent energy crisis. The level and composition of electricity consumption reflects the limited rate of access to electricity in the residential sector and the weak role of the productive sector in the country's economy. Despite recent positive shifts in the energy mix, the performance of the electricity sector remains suboptimal due to political instability, lack of planning, vested interests, and lack of investments. The next step is identification and articulation of the goal. Given challenges related to lack of access to electricity, the potential desired impacts of a project like this could be energy security and diversification of electrical mix, economic growth, especially through an expansion of tourism, as well as reduction in gender inequality and improvement in women empowerment. The next step in theory of change is designing the project. This involves unwrapping what the program components would look like. That is, what would your inputs be and how will they be delivered on the ground? For instance, in this case study, this would involve funding for the project, human resources, be it the engineers, technicians, project managers, etc., to execute the project, land where this mini solar grids would be set up, as well as solar panels and batteries and other components of the PV systems. Some of the key activities would include site identification and identification of women-headed households, which were a core sub-target for this project, design, supply, and installation of the solar PV plants and distribution network, as well as last-mile connection service, that is the procurement and installation of equipment to connect households, enterprises, and community infrastructures. Once you have designed your program through your inputs and activities, you start laying out the subsequent building blocks step by step, connecting your product or program to the goal. This is as a series of if and then statements forming a results chain. For instance, in our example, the output would involve plants being installed and producing electricity through renewable resources and consumers being connected to the local electricity distribution network. These outputs would then transform into outcomes in the form of expansion of installed electricity generation and distribution capacity, consumers using renewable sources of electrical energy and reduced dependence on diesel generators, as well as increased population access to quality and low-cost electrical energy. And if these outcomes are achieved, we hope to achieve our final goal or impacts, which is energy security and diversification, economic growth, and reduction in gender inequality. And this is how all the elements of a theory of change, the inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts are logically connected in a causal pathway. And last but definitely not the least, you need to explicate your assumptions. Assumptions are the conditions necessary for the cause and effect relationships between the different elements of a theory of change to hold true. They're the conditions that make it possible to link activity to outputs, outputs to outcomes, and outcomes to impacts. For instance, in this case study, one assumption that we are making for the activities to translate into outputs is that there are no land use restrictions, such as conservation areas or sacred sites, and the fact that there is broad community support to select target communities and enable project implementation. Similarly, a key assumption that needs to hold between outputs and outcomes is that consumers see value in use of renewable energy sources relative to traditional sources like diesel generators. An assumption associated with generating the impacts is that increased access to energy actually leads to economic growth, with special considerations that benefit women in particular. But the real world is complex, and social ecological systems in which climate projects are based are even more complex. As we discussed in video 1, these require systems thinking. Using a system lens, you can look at the theory of change with a broader scope. This means not just understanding how the intervention intends to achieve the impact, but also the interactions between the larger system and the intervention. While it may not be feasible to include everything in a project's theory of change, we must be mindful that projects bear risks, and climate projects must pay special regards to risks, especially to the environment. For instance, you may choose to investigate how your intervention interacts with other conditions that fall outside the initial project scope. A project may have unintended effects, that is, effects that the project was not built to achieve. These should be listed. There are other aspects that can be taken into consideration, even when they will not be represented in the theory of change. For instance, there can be external elements that influence the intended impacts and that cannot be controlled in project implementation. So to conclude, theory of change is a framework used to understand the causal pathway for achieving a desired outcome in projects. It helps not only in designing the intervention and unpacking how your program will ultimately bring about a change in the outcome, but also in designing the evaluation. What are the questions that you're trying to answer through the evaluation? What are the indicators you have identified at every step of your theory of change, which will then identify the data that you need to collect? In particular, it helps evaluators answer the black box question and understand better why a project worked or did not. And finally, approaching the theory of change with a system lens allows us to consider the interconnectedness and broader impacts of projects, especially in the context of complex challenges like climate change. Thank you for watching this series of videos on monitoring and evaluation in climate action.